Hey everyone, Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5 Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Are we done? Because I lost all that feed.
Yeah, we're ready.
All right, welcome along then. Sorry, guys, my internet blip has missed all the videos and everything else. Professional start. Welcome along to the flagship show here at 5 Yard Rush again. I'm back as ever with the big man Murf, and we are incredibly pleased to have with us today the founder of Late Round Fantasy, king of the short form podcast, and I believe he's on a magical journey to be a tea connoisseur, and I'm sure we're about to find out a bit more about that. It's J.J Zachariason. How are you, sir? Are you well?
I am great, and yes, I feel like I've come a very long way to be a tea connoisseur. I mean, Murf definitely knows my history with tea. I feel like now, though, I'm like a pseudo, maybe not quite a professional, but I'm getting there.
Yeah, because the first time you came on, it was literally tea in a microwave.
I'm embarrassed.
Yeah, it's fine. We're embarrassed for you, but this shows growth. You know, you've got growth in your models. You've got growth. You're just growing everywhere, including how to make tea. Last time we were on, you bought sort of a kettle that goes on the stove. Is that still the current situation, or have you upgraded the setup even further?
So I've got an electric kettle that I use, which seems to do the job, does it well. I'm still drinking a lot of chamomile tea. That's usually my go-to. It's just nice and relaxing. Just got some lemon and ginger tea that I'm excited to try later today. So yeah, I mean, like I feel like, you know, I've come a long way from microwaving tea to doing it a more proper way.
Yeah. Now, are you a bag in all the way? Like, do you leave the bag in for the flavor, or do you take it out on occasion?
Bag in all the way.
Yeah,
bag is always. Is that a bad thing to do? Is that a good thing to do?
That's the way to do it. Unless it's a regular tea. So obviously, like English breakfast or one of those blends, then you would Earl Grey. Then you would take it out and just put a bit of milk in, and that would be you. And always put the milk in last. Never put it in at the bottom. Like, that's a major no-no.
Okay, that's good to know. So black teas, if you will, are better to not let it seep forever. Whereas I'm a big herbal tea guy, so I'm always just like letting it sit in there to get all that flavor. Yeah,
so fruit teas, herbal teas, all of those bag in all the way. 100%. That's how you should do it. But black teas, you take the bag out. Otherwise, it goes too dark. It just gets too strong. But yeah, you nailed it. That's good,
man. I feel good.
I'm so proud. It's like watching my firstborn like take the leap out into the future. It's amazing.
Feeling good.
But also, this has been a really big year for you already. Tell us, for those who've been under a rock and don't know, the big sign in the background should be the clue. But like, tell us 2022. You out on your own, and tell us what's going on, how everything's going, and the success of late round fantasy football.
Yeah, so back at the end of January, beginning of February, I decided to leave my job at FanDuel as editor-in-chief there. No hard feelings. Wasn't like a situation where like we hated each other. It was more so just I've wanted to sort of go off on my own and do my own thing and control everything that I'm creating and all that. And so I started late round fantasy football. And so far, so good. It's been a blast. I think the thing that's been best and most awesome is just everyone is just incredibly just kind and understanding if something breaks or goes wrong or because that happens. I mean, it's going to happen. I'm going to get I posted rankings to the Patreon page where Mark Andrews was listed as a wide receiver and just stuff like that. Like that's going to happen, but no one is like yelling at me and getting upset or anything like that. They're just like, hey, why is Mark Andrews a wide receiver? And then I just go and fix it up. So things have been really great. I mean, I feel really, really, really lucky to be able to do this and, have my own thing like this and be able to speak and talk to people that I love. The community that's being built is a lot of fun. There's a Discord now, through the Patreon and sell the rookie guide, the prospect guide. A couple months ago, rather. So that's been a blast. I mean, it's just been a lot of fun for me to be able to do things content wise that I really wasn't able to do in my last gig.
It's incredible to see, and everything you're doing right now is amazing. We're going to talk about the rookie guide in just a bit, because we're going to give away some copies. So I'm going to purchase some copies to support you, because you've been so good to us and been on this show, and it's a great resource. And for someone who bought it right away, got it. It's amazing just to see. It's great because for those that perhaps aren't math people, you spell it out in a way that you don't need to be a math person to understand the content in there. And I think that's what's great about it, is you can pick up the guide. If they listen to you in the pod, sometimes, they might be trying to follow along and I don't get all the math. I don't get where everything's coming from, but they get the end result and end product. Here, they get the process of where you're connecting the dots without being a math guy, which I think it's a hard skill to get right, but you've definitely nailed it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, I really approach everything I do with the idea of transparency at the front of my mind. I want people to, know that I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm not just trying to say hey, just trust me on this. I know that it's going to work or something like that. I really want people to understand the process behind everything that I do. And the prospect guide is a way of allowing people to sort of see what goes on behind the scenes, for me to get sort of the quote answers or the things that I feel, my takes. And hopefully it resonates with people. I hope, as you noted, I do hope that anyone who is really into math or not into math at all can walk away from reading that prospect guide and say, hey, I learned something new.
And I can testify that they absolutely can. I'm definitely a math guy and walked away from it better and smarter as a result. But I know a lot of people who aren't, and perhaps are even just starting out on that process. And I recommend, if you're going out there thinking about, and I get asked this question so often, how do you do projections? How do you do models? How do you start to look at data and understand it? And it takes years. I mean, you talk about it at the start of the guide. You said from 2012 you wrote late round QB, and that was kind of your first foray, and it took you 5 years to get to the point where you were putting together these models and for rookies in particular. And just keep looking at it. You're going to be wrong. You're going to make a load of mistakes, learn from them. But also, when people do produce guides or ways in which they explain it, read it and digest it, and ask that person questions. I know you're really engaging on Twitter, that you will answer questions on how you've got to that process and explain it in a bit more detail. Maybe not giving away the secret sauce, but you'll at least explain the concept behind it. So I think that's the easiest way. I mentioned you a lot. I mentioned Dwayne McFarlane has got a great article he wrote, I think all the way back when he's at Matt Waldman RSP, where he talks about writing projections. I think those kind of pieces that's how I learned. You learn from how others have done it, and then you put what you value, what you think is important, and then start to build it that way.
Yeah, I mean, you just build upon what past ideas have come forward, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff, a lot of the metrics that I utilize in the guide, or for my models, I should say, are metrics that people at places like RotoViz have been using for a long time. And I've been using them as well, but I get introduced to some of this stuff via other people doing this work. I'm not sitting here saying that I'm the first person to say early declare status matters at wide receiver. I do think that the things that I've combined together for this model in particular is unique and proprietary, but I don't think that the inputs themselves, the individual inputs, are proprietary at all. I mean, everyone's utilizing a lot of those numbers and methods. So I think it's really, the way that I've always used the model and utilize these models is that it's just a really good baseline for me. It's like a gut check for me. It's to make sure that I'm not straying too far away from what's logical. I still have made that mistake even with the models, but the goal here is to just be as logical and methodical and process oriented as possible so that you can win year in and year out.
Yeah. And what you do such a great job of is the accountability piece. You mentioned where things didn't go right, and you've made tweaks, and you've mentioned where you've hit. And it's not just hey, look, I hit these guys, therefore I'm right all the time. You're quick to specify that you do get stuff wrong, that there's always going to be players that will miss in your models, and there's players that you will miss in your models that will just break out. And that's going to happen, but it's about obtaining a better percentage than the public.
Right.
In terms of making sure you get more wins versus losses on ADP value guys and outperforming as frequently as possible. And then that's how you win, right? More often than not. If you've got a better batting average, then you're going to have more chances to win.
Exactly.
So, and that's what I love about it. You do explain it really, really clearly. So as I sort of mentioned, if you don't want to wait, and I wouldn't wait for me to next week, we're going to give away 3 copies, as I mentioned. But you can go on to lateround.com. I'm going to post a link directly to where you can buy the guide in the show notes when we put this out tomorrow. But for those of you live, go on to lateround.com. You can sign up there and you can buy the copy. It's instant download, JJ, I believe.
Yeah, it'll go straight to your email, whatever email you use, whether it's through PayPal or you inputted your email, whatever email you utilize, it'll go to that email. And
so we've talked a lot about the sort of the process, but what is, for those people, what is actually in there? What is the actual content piece in the guide, other than just saying, who are what players?
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to make it differentiated in some way versus what you can get elsewhere, because there's a lot of great guides out there, but a lot of them are player focused, and understandably so. I mean, the people who put them together do a really, really good job, and they're also sometimes even like rookie draft strategy focused and stuff like that. The way that I see it is I think transparency, as I noted earlier, I think it's just really important as an analyst. I think that people should understand what analysts are looking at and why they're looking at it. And so what I did was, I have a prospect model that looks at running backs and wide receivers that I've sort of built over the last 5 years or so. And it's been tweaked. It gets tweaked every single year, just based off of, different things that I've learned about different metrics and stuff, or different data that becomes available, what have you. So I've tested this model, both of these models, the running back and wide receiver ones, against draft capital itself and against rookie draft ADP. And it's more predictive than both of those things. It's way more predictive than draft capital, and it's a little bit more predictive than rookie draft ADP. So which tells you that you are gaining an edge if you were to just look at this model and utilize players and draft players with what the model is saying. But in the guide, I talk about what goes into the models, both of the models, and then I profile every running back and wide receiver that went to the NFL Combine. So, there are some guys who were not invited to the Combine that you might like, but I had to draw a cutoff somewhere. I couldn't just profile 300 draft eligible players. So I usually use the Combine as the first baseline for the sample size within the model. And then if someone gets drafted, I also utilize that in the model. So the model sample size goes back to 2006, but I usually just date things back to 2011 when talking about it, just because it's an easy reference point. And within the model, the sample size is every running back and wide receiver who's either gone to the Combine or has been drafted since 2011. So you have a fairly large sample size, since 2006. So you have a fairly large sample size with what the model is working against, and what the model is then trying to predict is how well these players do across their first 3 years in the NFL. And so, there's a lot of different ways that you can measure against that. You can look at their best season across their first 3. I use what's called best 2 years, which is just their top 2 seasons in points per game, and average that out as their best 2 years number. It's just not that intuitive in terms of just like communicating that idea. So a lot of times I'll just talk about a player's best season, but I did find that, equating this to a player's best 2 seasons was a little bit more helpful. So that's all the prospect model. And then also in the guide, you can get the year 2 model, which is basically looking at a player's prospect score and then how he performed as a rookie, and utilizing those 2 inputs, many inputs as a rookie. You're looking at different production metrics and such, but utilizing those 2 things to come up with a year 2 score. So what it'll tell you is how we expect a player to perform in points per game in years 2 and 3 of their career. So they've already been rookies. You're looking, a guy like Elijah Mitchell, for instance. How should we view him, given the fact that he was a later round rookie pick who did very, very well? There is a signal to the fact that he was not an early round pick. And then what I did with the year 2 model, which I think was fun, was create these things called journey comparables, which essentially looks at players and how they entered the league in terms of prospect score, and then how they performed in year 1. And I compare players that have gone through these similar journeys. So for instance, going back to the Elijah Mitchell example, some of his journey comparables were guys like Zach Stacy, Andre Ellington, James Robinson, these like later round players who didn't look that good. in terms of the model entering the league because they were late round picks. They're not going to look good in the model. But then they did very well year one. And then you can sort of like utilize that and say, maybe this guy has done, maybe a player has done this in the past, and maybe I shouldn't be that bullish on him, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's just a lot of information that you can get from the year two model. It's helpful for me. There's a couple guys that I thought jumped out as surprises who looked better in the year two model than I expected. But overall, you get to see the inner workings of that model and the prospect model, and hopefully it'll help you win your fantasy leagues.
It's amazing, and it's so useful to see that in print and just give you pause for thought and think about these sort of things and get ahead, because too many people think about what they need immediately. They look at their team and they look at it now and thinking, I'm going in the draft, I'm in a super flex league, I only have 3 QBs, I have to take a QB round 1, even if they're not that great, because I need the numbers, there's no one else. And this should give them pause for thought to think, actually, you don't need to draft on need, you draft on value. Think about that second year score. Don't put a band-aid on it. If it's not going to fix it, you might as well just hemorrhage in the same place you're going to hemorrhage anyway, and try and build up your capital in other ways. You've got trade bait, you've got abilities to make points up in other areas. And I think that's where the second year score is going to really, really help.
Yeah.
On that sort of vein, because I want to kind of do this for this next bit in sort of 2 parts. For those, there are many people that are just sort of getting into Dynasty, especially here in the UK. People in their sort of first year, second year, third year. Lockdown 2020 was a huge Dynasty boom in the UK, fair to say, I think. But there are people that perhaps are just looking at and thinking, I just need to know who to draft in the first round, second round, etc. But what are some tips that you can give sort of more, I don't want to call them junior rookie players, but those sort of Dynasty players in their first couple of years, that you can give them some tips to level up on their current process, whether that's just listening to podcasts or just looking at a draft guide and just valuing, say, just draft capital. Well, he's a first round running back, therefore he's got to be the best running back in the class, etc.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely say consuming information is not a bad thing. I mean, there's definitely going to be analysts who are generally a little bit better than others, but if you can just consume information from analysts who talk about the players and don't necessarily give skewed takes and just say like, oh, you got to get this guy no matter what, but don't give you reasons why. I think that's a good idea. To that point though, I do think that when you listen to non-fantasy draft analysts who do an incredible job with what they do, because they're looking at, beyond skill position players, and they're even evaluating skill position players really well. Always understand what you're trying to solve. And this is the one thing that I'm trying to really get across, at least this offseason. I have in the past too, but something that I try to get across in the guide when I talked about the things in the guide is that I'm trying to solve fantasy football. I'm not trying to solve real football. And there is a difference there. And I think a really good example of that is with like receiving running backs or how they performed in college. If there's a running back who looks really, really good on the ground, and as a good pure runner, that might give a real football draft analyst, a non-fantasy draft analyst, that might allow them or force them to give that running back a really good grade. And that's fine, because that's their process and their evaluation. But we know that pass catching skill set is incredibly important for fantasy football. I mean, targets are far, far more valuable than attempts are in even a standard league, let alone a PPR league. So understand what you're trying to solve here, and you're trying to solve fantasy football. And then I'd also say, utilize draft capital, as you mentioned. They're a really good example of this is, and to this point, don't let landing spots skew the way that you view a player too much. A really good example of this, years ago, Samaje Perine, when he came out, he got drafted by Washington, and he was a 4th round pick. He was a day 3 pick, and he was a 1st round rookie draft pick in rookie drafts. And it was only because he landed in Washington, where they didn't have any other running backs around there. And so people assume that he would be getting a lot of work, but it didn't happen to that degree, because you have to also be good. Like, we need good players first and foremost. So, and Samaje Perine's fine. He's actually had a pretty long lasting career, but like, at the end of the day, he's certainly not a workhorse. So definitely utilize draft capital and understand that does matter. Don't pick a round 4 or 5 player over a guy who went in round 1, because inherently to draft capital is evaluation, the way that an NFL team views a player, right? And they spend millions and millions of dollars scouting these guys. So, yes, they're wrong plenty and they do stupid things all the time. And there are some teams that do really stupid things at certain skill positions like LA or, Seattle's done some really weird things at times, like with Rashad Penny. But, at the end of the day, they are decent at finding these guys and understanding who's good and who's not. So definitely utilize draft capital. And then the last thing that I got to shout out, it's just really, really important to understand that you're going to be wrong and embrace that variance. There's far too often people go into a draft and they say, I really love this one player. And then that player goes in round 6 and they stick with that take. They just say, oh no, but I was right about that player. I was right about that player. You're going to be wrong about these guys all the time. And honestly, you should feel good if a guy that you really, really liked goes a lot later in the draft, because it's saving you, the heartache of that player just naturally not doing well because he was a 6th round pick. So you can say, okay, he was a 6th round pick, I'm not going to get him. Whereas if it's a round 2 guy who you liked, and then he just flops, that's going to happen. But understand that you're going to be wrong. Embrace that variance. There's ways to embrace that versus the market, as I always say. You're going to be facing 11 different league mates, 13 different league mates, however big your league is. And you got to just understand that you're going to be wrong plenty. And if you can sort of play the market, understanding that you're going to be wrong, it can really take you a long way.
Yeah, love that. I think it's so true, because I've also found I play with people who perhaps when they get to the late rounds are so in love with one or two guys, they take the same person in like every draft.
Yeah.
So you kind of know it's coming, which is fine, because if you love this guy, if he hits, great. If it doesn't, it's not a lot of capital. But I also think diversify a little bit. If you're going to take my late round guy this year is Michael Woods, for example. Absolutely love Michael Woods. Think he's someone who potentially, if he gets into a decent spot and makes a roster, he could do some things in the NFL. He showed it at the combine. He showed how great he can catch a ball. I mean, you put a highlight reel at the combine up alone. But he's not someone I'll be getting in or I want in every single draft, because if he doesn't work out, that's a lot of wasted capital, even if you do like the guy. So yeah, I think you got to diversify a little bit if you play in multiple leagues. But for those more seasoned players, you have this model, and I don't want to go sort of too in the weeds with this because I want people to buy the guide. But what are some of the sort of metrics that you look at that are really important when deciding on who he is? Well, for your model, will tell. But what are some metrics that people should look out for to sort of help them either build their own model or just to keep an eye on, if they don't have time to build a model before the draft, which is probably likely, that they can keep an eye on and think, okay, I should go and pay attention to these one or two or whatever metrics.
Yeah, look, I don't expect 99.9% of people to build a model. Like, I don't think that's a reasonable expectation for people who have normal 9-to-5s, And so I would say the one thing to keep in mind, and this is sort of what I try to tell people when I introduce them to this concept of essentially prospecting through data, right? You're not necessarily like, I still watch film. I still make sure that these guys look good because it's important to, whenever I'm going on podcasts and stuff. I don't want to sound like an idiot. But the one thing that I always say is not every productive college player becomes productive in the NFL. I think there's a lot of people out there who say, well, this guy had a lot of production. Why didn't he do anything in the NFL? Well, not every productive college player becomes productive in the NFL, but almost every productive NFL running back or wide receiver was productive in college. There are trends that we can look at to say, okay, this guy was productive. Okay. So the way that I sort of approach things is every single player going into the draft process and the prospecting process is a perfect prospect. And then I start to look at all the different things that I can sort of knock for that player. One of the things for wide receivers, for instance, was he an early declare? So did he come out of school early? And that the reason why that gets signal is because, it shows that the player was likely talented because he's leaving college early to go to the NFL. And if a player had to play a full 4 years, then there might be some issues there. But, production metrics overall do matter. I'd say probably one of the best that you could look at for wide receivers in combination with breakout age, because age-adjusted production is very important at wide receiver. It's somewhat important at running back, but it's really important at wide receiver. And that's essentially just when a player was first very productive in college. That's what breakout age essentially tells you. But if you use breakout age alongside yards per team pass attempt, which is just telling you how many yards a receiver has through the air, divided by the number of pass attempts a team has. So it's sort of like a market share statistic, which is essentially, market share being how big of a piece of the pie a player got on his own team. It's essentially telling you that, but it's also sort of like a rate statistic in a way because it's per pass attempt. So if you look at age adjusted production metrics, especially yards per team pass attempt, that can go a long way for wide receivers. Yards per team pass attempt is really predictive in and of itself. And then if you can combine that with like draft capital, then you're great. You're golden. And you can look at the best season for a player for that. It doesn't have to be like his final year or anything like that. And then at running back, draft capital matters more at running back than it does at wide receiver. There's more correlation in my model with draft capital for running backs than at wide receiver because it just gets more weight. But I've utilized reception share alongside yards per team play for running backs pretty effectively. A lot of people will say, oh, it doesn't matter if a running back catches passes at the collegiate level and it being predictive for how he catches passes at the NFL level. Across a large sample, that's not totally wrong. But I would argue that a player still needs a baseline to hit. Usually I want a running back to hit like a 10% best season reception share. So he sees 10% of his team's completions. I do think that there's a baseline that, it doesn't necessarily matter if the guy had like a 27% reception share, which wouldn't happen, but a 27% reception share versus a 21% reception share, not a big deal, once you get that high. But if a guy has a 3% reception share, you have to ask yourself why. Why is he not catching passes out of the backfield? And, it might just be that the offense isn't good or the offense doesn't want to throw the ball the running back's way. But it also could be the fact that the team is not wanting to utilize that player in more than one way. They just want to use him as a pure runner, as an early down back. And that might not tell you that the guy is good or bad at passing at catching the ball, but it does tell you more than likely that he's not as talented because the team isn't giving him the ball in every single play that they can give him the ball, that they want to give him the ball. And so there is signal to reception share, I found, but it's more of a baseline signal than anything else. And then when it comes to like the NFL Combine and stuff, the only thing that I really worry about is speed score at running back. You don't want a wide receiver to just completely bomb the Combine. You don't want a running back to completely bomb the Combine, but I would argue that that's going to be reflected in draft capital anyway. So you're sort of double counting if you say, oh, this guy was really, really bad at the Combine. Oh, he also got, a 6th round capital. Oh, he's going to be terrible no matter what. Well, the 6th round capital is likely because he didn't do very well at the Combine in the first place. So wide receivers, I found that athleticism at the Combine does not really matter because generally the guys that we're talking about are not horrific athletes. The guys that we care about in fantasy football. And then at running back, I just need a speed score of 90, which is a weight adjusted 40 time. There's a formula that Bill Barnwell created years ago where you just adjust a player's 40 time for his weight, because obviously a 228-pound running back running a 4.3 is a lot more impressive than a 170-pound running back doing the same thing. And so I really look at speed score of 90 as a baseline in my model. I've seen other people use like 93, 95, something like that. 100 is usually a good mark for a running back, which is why 90 seems to make sense as just a baseline to hit. But there are some guys, like even in this class, that didn't hit a 90. Usually you'll get a handful of them, like 3 to 4 of them who aren't able to hit that mark. But it is a mark that does seem to get some signal.
To someone like Kyron Williams, for example.
That's right. Yep, exactly. Kyron Williams is someone who, again, it's not like I'm saying don't draft Kyron Williams no matter what. I'm just saying that my model looks at Kyron Williams with his 83 speed score and it says he's getting dinged for this. Like, this is not a good thing. And there are running backs historically, if you look historically over the last 10 years, there hasn't been a single running back with a sub 90 speed score that's been successful in the NFL. And so, you're just utilizing all that and you're utilizing probabilities to try to make sounder decisions.
Okay. Wow. I've just seen some breaking news. Not really. I've just seen that Denzel Ward has been extended by the Browns. He's got a 5-year, $100.5 million contract.
Man, they sure are throwing around money.
Yeah. I'd like to see the breakdown of that. I just saw it come across and I was like, he was a number 4 overall pick in the draft, but
yeah,
$100 million for a cornerback.
Good for him.
I know it's not going to get all $100 million. I'm not that
sure
silly, but that's wild.
Yeah.
Okay. Just quickly before we go into the players, or at least some of the players, helicopter view of this class, because it gets dinged quite a lot, to use one of your words, because there's not really any star quality. Well, there's not much star quality if we compare this to more recent drafts. What does your sort of model say in terms of that, and also sort of the depth of this class in terms of finding productive players who potentially are going to be good, but maybe not great for fantasy football? Or is there a different view? Was your sort of helicopter view of the class as a whole?
Yeah, I would say that the wide receiver class is flat and deep. And what I mean by that is I could see 5, maybe even 6, if one lands in the right spot, wide receivers be the wide receiver 1 in rankings after the draft. I think that there's a lot of ways that things could really break down. And my model looks at things the same way, but obviously my model utilizes draft capital, and right now it's just projected draft capital. So I do have a tier of 5 players right now, 5 wide receivers who are all first round wide receivers who look like they're first round wide receivers. I think that those guys could all make a case to be the 101, but again, that's the difference between or 102 if you're looking at Breece Hall. But again, that's 5 guys that are 5 deep. So if you're looking at the 102 in your draft versus the 106 or 107, there's really not that big of a difference pre-draft right now, I would say, between those 2 picks. So that could open up an opportunity to trade back and to try to gain some value that way. But I will say, this is where embracing variance and being wrong really comes into play, because it's all related to the market and what the market thinks and how the market views this. And by the market, I'm saying your league mates, right? If every single one of your league mates understands that this is a flatter class at wide receiver where it's very, very deep, but there's not these like Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith type studs, then all of a sudden, you're not going to gain that value by trading back necessarily, because everyone understands that. So if you want to embrace variance, you could potentially say, oh, I'm going to get the 102, and maybe something crazy happens in the draft. And, a guy like Drake London, let's say, just like somehow Kansas City trades up and they really want him or something like that. And all of a sudden he's with Patrick Mahomes and he becomes the consensus 102 in rookie drafts as a result of that. So things can go down in the NFL draft that can change things. And you shouldn't be shocked if we leave the NFL draft with a very clear-cut wide receiver 1 in this class. And if that's the case, then trading up actually right now, if the rest of your league is thinking a certain way, trading up right now actually might be a contrarian smart move. So it all depends on sort of that idea of embracing variance, but it depends on how the rest of your league is sort of viewing these players. That's at wide receiver. At running back, I think Breece Hall is the only true stud. And then you get into, I like Kenneth Walker enough to say he's the RB2. And then you just get into a lot of question marks. But I do think this running back class is deep enough to give us some fantasy producers. It's just a matter of, where these guys go, what kind of draft capital they get, and who, just looks the best post draft.
Absolutely. So let's get into this. Let's start with quarterback. We've seen some mocks where there's going to be 5 QBs taken in round 1. We've seen some mocks where there's going to be 0 QBs taken in round 1. I don't think either's going to happen. I think it's going to be 2 to 3 potentially, but we'll know for sure. Maybe everyone goes on a crazy run and maybe there is 5. Who knows? What is your model look at for QBs in this particular class? Because it has been knocked quite a lot. There's not really a stud per se. There may be a sort of a clear consensus QB1, but behind that, there's probably quite a lot of a model. I mean, what's your model sort of saying on these QBs? And is this a bad year to try and think about taking one reasonably early in a 1 QB, and then where would you sort of sit them in a super flex league?
Yeah, so I still haven't built a good enough quarterback model to go out and say, here are the quarterbacks that I love based on the model. Or same with tight end. Tight end gives me the same issues, but eventually I'll get there where I feel good about what I'm producing and what the model is saying. But I will say there's certain inputs that you should be looking at with quarterbacks. And I've talked to one guy who's been very into this is Jim Sonis from Number Fire. And I talked to Jim on the Late Round podcast a couple weeks ago. And things like age is really important at quarterback. And it's not just age, but years of being a starter for his collegiate team. Joe Burrow and Mac Jones doing what they did the last couple of years where they came out as these seniors and they really didn't break out until late. Joe Burrow didn't have that great season until his final year. Fortunately, those seasons were so good that it was easy to see why they could be good in the NFL. But generally we don't see that translate or happen very often. And that's sort of what we're getting with like a Kenny Pickett, where Pickett, and look, I went to Pitt. I am a Kenny Pickett fan. I love him to death. But I have to be realistic whenever I'm analyzing this stuff. And, a guy like Pickett, his numbers were fine, but they weren't like Joe Burrow good. And then at the same time, he was a starter for so many years and he's coming out older. Those are the things that you don't like to see. And he's relatively mobile, but he's not going to give you, he's more Joe Burrow mobile than he is Kyler Murray mobile, right? And so, he won't likely give you that many points on the ground unless they allow the fake sliding to occur at the NFL level. But I think the only guy that I'm really interested in right now at the top of like a super flex draft is probably Malik Willis, just because of what he could potentially do with his legs. I don't think he's going to necessarily make a Lamar Jackson type impact. But I do think that he could be maybe a Jalen Hurts type at the next level. I've seen people like trying to like flip Jalen Hurts for like a high super flex pick and maybe get Malik. I don't really understand that because I think that Malik's ceiling or maybe like 80th percentile outcome. I shouldn't say ceiling because, player ceilings are crazy, but I think like an 80th percentile outcome for Malik Willis is like basically Jalen Hurts right now. So I would probably just stick with Jalen Hurts in that case and not try to do something crazy like that. But I do think that that's sort of what we're hoping for with a guy like Willis. And then, there's other guys that we might see in the mid to late first that could be interesting, like a Desmond Ridder. I think, if he is able to escape the pocket more and do a little bit more with his athleticism at the NFL, we might see some surprise numbers on the ground from him at the NFL level. But Malik is the only guy that I think is going to really have that true QB1 potential at the next level.
Yeah. So it's a case of, if you can get Willis, fine. What would be, I know sort of where you've kind of got him in the guide, where you would feel comfortable sort of taking him, which is sort of, if I believe it's like second round.
Yeah.
Do you think he's worth reaching for in sort of the tail end of the first round of this rookie draft in a 1 QB league, or are you sort of adamant that it's just not worth that risk at all compared to the types of players who you'll be passing on at the tail end of that?
Yeah, I don't. And the reason why I say that is because even a guy like Hurts in a single quarterback league is still not going to go in the top 50 of startup drafts. It's just not going to happen. And so if that's an 80th, 90th percentile outcome from Malik Willis, then that's the ceiling, right? Is an outside the top 50 pick. Whereas if you look at the late first and the wide receivers, you might be able to get there in a single quarterback league. We're talking George Pickens. We're talking Skye Moore. There's a lot of good wide receivers in particular in that range that you might be able to get. So I would much rather get them, have that chance to have like a legit top 30 dynasty asset at wide receiver, not just at the position, but overall, as opposed to going that quarterback route.
Okay. And I think that sums up where we are with quarterbacks. Let's move on to running backs. You mentioned that Breece Hall is effectively the 101, and I completely agree. I went as far on a podcast to say that for me, Breece Hall might be one of the best prospects I've seen at running back over the last 10 years. How, in your model, where would he kind of need to go in order to be sort of very near the top of your model over the last few years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I looked at, I love messing around with draft capital in the model because it shifts things. And again, running back is tied to draft capital in a decent way. I mean, there's a decent correlation. It's not all. I'm not just taking draft capital and ranking running back that way. But yes, it does matter. And I did look right now on NFL mock draft database. He has an overall draft capital of 37. So when I input that, he's in the 96th percentile in my model. And anything over the 95th percentile at running back has very, very good hit rates. Same thing at wide receiver. Anything over the 95th percentile, very, very good hit rates. If you look at last year, Travis Etienne was like a 97th percentile guy. Naji Harris was like a 98th percentile guy. And that's largely because they went in the first round. We're talking about 37th overall capital versus 22nd with like a guy like Naji. So, I would say if he goes in the first round, which I think is highly unlikely, but if he does go in the first round, we're looking at him being a 98th-ish percentile running back, which again, just last year, Naji Harris showed us why he had that kind of score in the model. So I think Breece Hall is a stud. If I look at this class overall, I think that Breece is very easily the RB1 because there's concerns about literally every other running back. I mean, Kenneth Walker, the guy that I just mentioned, I don't mind Walker. I've tweeted about Walker a ton and I've talked about him on my podcast. But I don't mind Walker. I think he's fine. I think he might be the best pure running running back in this class. Like he's very, very good on the ground. The problem is he has a 5.4% best season reception share, which, is just not good at all. And you can sit there and make excuses and say, and maybe I wouldn't even call it excuses. You can sit there and give reasons as to why Kenneth Walker's reception share is as low as it is. Maybe Michigan State didn't throw the ball to running backs that much. That's what I hear all the time. But the other thing I will say is that he was at Wake Forest before Michigan State, and he didn't catch passes there either. And not only that, but if you look at Kenneth Walker on a yards per route run basis, not very good. I mean, he was not very efficient through the air. It doesn't mean that he cannot catch balls at the NFL level, but if you look at players historically who have gone in the second round, third round, who have not had high reception shares, the hit rate is pretty brutal. I mean, it's not very good. I sent a tweet out, a thread last week or the week before, and I looked at running backs who went after the first round, but in the top 100 over the last 10 years. And if you look and compare of guys who had a best season reception share under 8% and over 8%, it's glaring when you look at ceiling. The floor didn't change that much in terms of first 3 seasons, max point per game season. So if you take a player's first 3 years and look at his best season, that's what I'm comparing against. The average max points per game season for guys who had reception shares above 8% versus under 8%, it favored the guys who caught more passes at the NFL level, but it wasn't dramatic. But what was dramatic were the number of players who had 16 plus point per game seasons across their first 3 years. It didn't happen ever for a running back under an 8% best season reception share. And again, this is about probability, right? I'm not sitting here saying that it's impossible for Kenneth Walker to break this mold and be a decent pass catcher and go the route of a Josh Jacobs, let's say. Like, sure, that can potentially happen, but I'm playing probability. And if you're drafting Kenneth Walker over these like pretty good wide receivers that are going to go in the first round, I think that's a mistake. I think that's the difference. I have him as my RB2. I think he's the second best running back in this class, but I think that there is a major red flag there that gets signal in the model, which is why, Walker, where he's projected to go, he's like a 90th-ish percentile running back in the model. Nothing wrong with that, but he's definitely a tier below Breece Hall.
Yeah, and he was somebody going into the combine. I remember writing for Fantasy Pros about these rookie running backs, and I was like, to be honest, the combine for Kenneth Walker was probably more important than it was for Spiller or for Breece Hall, because Breece Hall had so much on tape and everything else. Yeah. He literally had to have had one of the worst combines ever to not be the RB1 in this class, and it wasn't going to happen.
Right.
But for me, it like Walker's combine saved him big time. Yeah. Because I think if his combine had been, let's say, Kyron Williams' combine, I think he falls out of. I remember writing at the time thinking, I'm not sure Kenneth Walker is a second round pick. I really am not convinced unless he smashes the combine, and he did. Right. So he did. He's going to be probably realistically a second round running back, and that's fine. But he really was on the edge there. It really did depend on that. With someone like Spiller, who I can understand why he's your RB3, but there is flags there, but there's less flags, I feel, for Spiller. I feel like he's someone who's going to be, dare I say it, almost like a plodder. He's going to put up production. It just might not be stellar. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair. He definitely, the one thing I will say about Spiller is, he didn't run at the combine, and then he ran at his pro day, and it wasn't super good, his 40. Mm-hmm. And again, I look at that 90 speed score threshold. It depends on how you adjust your 40 times at pro days, because at pro days, generally, historically, we've seen faster times get a little home cooking at your pro day versus how they perform at the combine. But what we saw this year at the combine is guys were running a lot faster. And there's theories out there that it's because of the turf that they're running on. It changed in Indianapolis, and maybe that has something to do with it. But regardless, if you do adjust rather the pro day numbers and add like 0.05 or 0.07, like depending on whatever method you use, he could drop below that 90 speed score threshold, which is a big deal. Like it does matter. And so I think that there are concerns about Spiller from an athleticism standpoint, because you ideally do want your running backs to still be athletic. And that's why I look at the speed score stuff. But, overall, I do think that Spiller's profile, like in my model, it does objectively look better than Kenneth Walker's. I'll say that. Like when I go through and I look at comps in the model, the comps for Isaiah Spiller, Joe Mixon pops up, Todd Gurley pops up. Like it looks better for Spiller than it does Kenneth Walker, where Kenneth Walker's top comp was Trey Mason, who did nothing, and he's like the way that I see it is his best range, his high range of outcomes here is that he's likely like a smaller version of Nick Chubb. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what's the problem with Chubb year in and year out? He's not catching passes. He's not giving you that true full-blown top 3 running back season consistently because he's not catching enough passes. And, I've seen people say with Walker, they're like, well, I only need him to be like a Josh Jacobs or a David Montgomery or something. Okay, that's fine. I think that's a reasonable thing if you're expecting that. But I don't need, I want my running backs to be top 5 running backs. I want them to I want them to appreciate well, gain value, be in that consideration to be a first round startup pick, as opposed to the guys like David Montgomery, who, David Montgomery can have stretches where he's an RB1 and he can be effective. Don't get me wrong, but Montgomery is consistently sort of like just in no man's land from a startup standpoint, where he's never really going to be drafted. A guy like that's never going to be drafted super, super high. Just because there's limitations there and they're relatively replaceable. I mean, that's the one thing too, is that if a player doesn't catch passes at the NFL level, they're much easier to replace. And that's scary. And that's something to always keep in mind with these guys.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Running back 4 is a pretty consensus chalky one. Rashad White has upside, could be someone who can reach a potential ceiling. Your RB5 I love. It's someone who probably isn't getting a lot of love right now on podcasts. He's someone who don't hear about too much, but Tyler Algiers is someone who I absolutely think is underrated. I think he's someone who can be very productive at the next level. I think he is landing spot dependent. So, I mean, I know every running back is, but I think he's someone who, if he lands on the right team, I think he's someone who could really have a very reasonable NFL career. What makes you like him over the likes of say like Brian Robinson and Tyler Bally and Damon Pierce?
Yeah, I think at this point, since those rankings went out, like there's just a giant tier of those guys, and it's going to be very dependent on what kind of draft capital they get. Because I do think a guy like Zamir White, for instance, he's trending upwards a lot. I could see him getting even drafted as the RB3 in this class, like being the 3rd running back off the board. A guy like Brian Robinson, I've been more and more into him, just thinking through the fact that he'll probably get decent draft capital because of the program he's coming from and all that. And, he could be an every down back, a true workhorse, a true, 3-down bell cow. But Tyler Algier is in that same profile. I mean, he to me looks like a James Conner type. And so if he has that draft capital, if a team wants to take a chance on him in like the early 3rd or something, which who knows? I mean, I do think that of all classes that we've seen in recent history, this is one where things can go in a lot of different directions. I mean, even last year, we knew there was a big 3, and then there was a huge drop to like Trey Sermon, who was a consensus RB4 for a lot of people. And then there was another drop because Sermon looked like someone, at least from a body size standpoint, who could maybe handle a full workload, and then he got day 2 capital. This year, we're going to see a decent number of running backs, I think, get day 2 capital, at least, like 3 or 4 at least. And because of that, we're going to just see a lot of shifting in rankings and such. But yeah, I mean, I think a guy like Algier, Zamir White, Brian Robinson, they're all sort of in this tier of bigger body backs who could be true workhorses.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how it all shakes out in 2 weeks' time, or 10 days' time, actually, I think, before it starts. Let's cover the wide receivers, because this is definitely the strong point of this class. As you said at the top, there's 5 guys who you kind of have in a flat tier, and then you have sort of another tier behind that. So probably no prizes for guessing who those 5 are. But for those who haven't, just maybe getting into this now, who are those 5? And then sort of why are they there? And then who are the guys behind who can potentially I will say threaten, but are going to be ones that you'll be looking at maybe the tail end of of round one of rookie drafts to keep an eye on, depending on landing spot and draft capital.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could run into a situation where 5 wide receivers go off the board close to the top 20, top 21, 22. And then you're going to see a lot of these other wide receiver needy teams in the back half of the first round draft wide receivers and get more wide receivers in the first round then. And we're seeing the reason why, if you get a wide receiver in the first round, you have that 5th-year option, and that could be huge. We're seeing the way wide receiver contracts are working around the NFL. That could be huge. So I think a lot of teams are going to try to take advantage of that. So the way that my model sees things right now, again, I mentioned this earlier, but 95th percentile or better is really good at the wide receiver position, really good hit rates. That's where Garrett Wilson, who's at a 98th percentile given projected draft capital, Drake London at 97th, and Chris Olave at 96th are all sitting there above that 95th mark. And then right below them at 94th is Jamison Williams and Treylon Burks. So those are the 5 that are locked in more than likely as first round picks. You can feel pretty decent about them in fantasy football, but I think at the end of the day, you could really shift any of those guys depending on where they go in the draft and landing spot, etc., to be the wide receiver 1 if you really wanted to. You can make a case for them. So that's the 5. But anything over the 80th percentile also looks pretty good in my model from a hit rate standpoint. Once you get below that 80th percentile mark, things start to look a little rough. And again, this is all with projected draft capital, so things can change a lot. But Jahan Dotson is one who's an 88th percentile guy. David Bell, who's dropping a lot in projected draft capital because his combine was so bad. He's inputted as an 85th overall pick, but he's still an 85th percentile wide receiver in the model.
Wow.
So he's someone to definitely keep an eye on according to the model. And again, the model doesn't care about athleticism at wide receiver, so that probably has is a big reason for that. George Pickens, someone I like a good bit, who had really, really good early college career production. Skye Moore, who I've been in love with since January, since I started all this, who can play all over the field. Smaller school guy, but he's an early declare from a smaller school, which you don't see very often. Wan'Dale Robinson ranks decent in my model, but he's not he's 5'8". And so I think more subjectively, I'll move him down my rankings. I don't think he's going to get amazing draft capital. And then potentially we would have Christian Watson in this grouping. But I will say my model does not like Christian Watson.
Wow,
Again,
okay.
it has a lot to do with the athleticism piece, smaller school, not an early declare. And his production wasn't that good despite being at a smaller school. So Christian Watson doesn't look that good. He's actually outside the 80th percentile right now with 45th overall projected draft capital. If you were to go in the first round, that would look a lot better. But I think if he goes in the first round, there's going to be other people in my league that just like him more than I do.
Okay. I'm curious on David Bell, because that's one who at the moment probably couldn't have had a worse postseason combine process. I mean, it's got to be up there as one of the worst I've ever seen, because he's someone who came in who was, talked about second round pick, going to be a very solid player at the NFL level. Then his combine happened, and he didn't have the best process before that, but the combine has really sunk him down. If he goes, say, third, what if he's a day 3 pick? If he's a day 3 pick, does that take him out of the reckoning of being an 80th percentile player?
Yeah, I mean, I can do it right now. Actually, David Bell, I should amend what I said earlier. I'm looking at the model right now. He has 70th overall draft capital. So that is into the third round, but it's not the 85th, like I said before. But let's just pretend he goes 120th overall. Then yeah, he drops out of that below that 80th range. So if he is a day 3 pick, I'll probably still like him more than the consensus would, but he's someone that would be very, very tough to like buy into, with a top 2 round rookie pick. But I will say with David Bell, one of his comps was Devier Posey, which is not a good comp, but one of his comps was Devontae Adams, who had very, very, very similar college production and was not athletic either at the combine. Now, I do think Devontae Adams is a better athlete than David Bell is, but they both sort of utilize their bodies and contort their bodies in ways, to create that separation for them. And Adams is a better wide receiver. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that David Bell is the next Devontae Adams, but it's nice to see that there are some good high range of outcome players as his comps out there. So, it's not just a list of bad player after bad player. So range of outcomes, super big, But I would love it if David Bell just falls and falls and falls in rookie drafts because people are worried about the athleticism, just because athleticism is not that big of a deal at wide receiver.
Yeah. He's not a player I'm keeping an eye on too closely. He's not someone I'm enamored with personally, but I think that's where fantasy football's so great, is you've got all these different takes and different views, and he's not someone that catches me, whereas someone like Desmond Ridder is someone I can see drafting a lot of, because he's someone that appeals to me greatly. They quickly do tight ends, and I know that tight ends are notoriously very difficult to predict. I mean, everyone could have predicted that Kyle Pitts is going to be good because of his draft capital and everything else he put up, but in comparison to recent classes, this is, again, not a bad class, not a great class, but it is deep. You kind of have two guys at the top, slight difference, and then there's a bit of a gap down. What sort of are your indicators for these tight ends in terms of where you've got them ranked and how you're viewing them right now?
Yeah, I would say that of all the positions since I published the prospect guide, tight end has changed the most for me. A lot of that is just because the combine, some of the pro days have happened and stuff, and we didn't have all the information at that time. And athleticism does matter at tight end. And so I would say that with tight end, I'm really just matching draft capital with athleticism. I'm seeing where those two things converge, and who looks the best based on that. And so a guy like Trey McBride, he's gonna be the tight end one, more than likely post draft. That's not really going to change, but I think there's a lot of movement that could occur. One guy who I am very high on, who I think could not break fantasy football, but be a true stud in fantasy football and really rise up and be a good pass catcher, is Jelani Woods out of Virginia. Okay. He's someone, again, I went to Pitt, and I remember watching Pitt this season facing Virginia, and I was watching with a buddy, and I literally made the comment, and I was like, why does he look like a man amongst boys on a football field? Like he looked like he was someone, he looked like he was he was fathering the corners that he was going up and the linebackers he was going up against. And so Jelani Woods, he's 6'7", 252 pounds, and he ran a 4.6 140. He's got incredible athleticism, really good college production too. So, if he ends up going in the top 100, which is possible, he'll probably be my tight end 2 in this class. Once the draft is over. So he's the one guy that I'm probably looking at the most, because athleticism does really translate at tight end.
I've been enjoying the Twitter side-by-sides of him and DK Metcalf.
Yeah.
And people have been posting all weekend. He is stacked. He's someone that is definitely catching some interest. It'd be interesting to see where he goes. Last question on these players, before I let you go, is right now, and it's hard to say, obviously, we haven't had many rookie drafts. We don't have loads of rookie ADP. Who's the one player you believe is going to get overdrafted based purely on hype and not on metrics or anything else that you feel is going to come back and really bite people if drafted too high?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of guys have an outcome where they're fine and where they're good in the NFL. Like a lot of these good wide receivers, that's definitely in their range of outcomes. But one player who I think could just go overdrafted because of the athleticism and because people will overstate the athleticism, and he's rising in projected draft capital, is a guy I mentioned, Christian Watson. He might go in the first round of the NFL draft. And if that happens, he's going to then all of a sudden be in the mix with those other wide receivers I mentioned, like Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Treylon Burks, all the, and Chris Olave and Jamison Williams, who I think all of those guys are just better wide receivers than he is. And so if Christian Watson does go in the first, he's going to have an overinflated draft value just because people are going to be grouping him with those other guys. Athleticism is why people are going to be in love with him. And sometimes athleticism translates. We've seen that with DK Metcalf. We've seen that with Chase Claypool, who I think is probably a better sort of higher end comp for Christian Watson. Like if he really ends up panning out, but he's not an early declare. He's coming from a smaller school, which that matters at wide receiver. His production profile is not even that good, despite being at this smaller school. So I just have concerns about Watson. I think the ceiling is there because athleticism can always translate, but I generally shy away from going after these athletic specimens at wide receiver because it's just an overrated thing at the wide receiver position. It does not matter nearly as much as some dynasty managers think. So a guy like Christian Watson, even Alec Pierce, he's another guy who's really, really athletic. He's going to get pushed up because of his athleticism, but his production profile is not very good. And so those two guys are the prototypical wide receivers that I generally avoid.
You're telling me Christian Watson is this year's Kadarius Toney?
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing that's weird though is that he's almost like the reverse Kadarius Toney.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, right. Like Toney just went so late despite being a first round pick. Whereas I genuinely think that if Watson, like I saw Watson get mocked by Mel Kiper to Green Bay this past week, 22nd overall, and if he goes 22nd overall, he's going to be a top. Like there will be rookie drafts where he goes in like the top 3 if that happens, and especially if he goes to Green Bay, he could be the guy right after Breece Hall. And I think that would be a mistake.
No, there we go. Before I give you a chance to plug where everything is, I do want to give people an opportunity to win these 3 guides that we're going to give away on next week's show. So all you need to do, I'm going to pin this episode, if you're watching it live on the stream on Twitter, I'm going to pin it to the 5 Yard Rush Twitter account. All you need to do is just go on to there, follow JJ, follow us, obviously you should be anyway, and just reply in the comments with the hashtag late round JJ. So then it's easier to search. Not saying that JJ would be a late round because he'd be my 101 of draft analyst, but there you go. But use the hashtag late round JJ, and I will do a draw on next week's show, and we will tell you who is going to be winning one of those 3 guides, and we'll get them out to you. Our show is going to be on Tuesday next week, so tune in next Tuesday, and we'll get the guides out to you Tuesday evening, so you'll have them. JJ, it's been a pleasure as always. Please tell everyone where they can find the guide, where they can find your Patreon, your work, and everything else that you do.
Yeah, everything's on lateround.com. There's a newsletter, there's Patreon, there's the guide, and there will be a draft guide that will launch in June that I hope people will want to check out.
Absolutely. Couldn't recommend it more. Do go on there. If you don't want to wait till next week to try and win one, I wouldn't wait. Go buy the guide now and digest it. Get ahead of your league mates. It's a wonderful piece of content, and it's truly brilliant. So do make sure you go out and buy it. And if you do miss out, go and buy it anyway. Let's support JJ in his endeavors to take over the world, and he needs more tea in his life. Right. So we need to sell guides so that JJ can get keep upgrading his tea game.
That's right.
But JJ, thanks so much for coming on. Rush Nation, I think you agree this has been a world-class episode with one of the best to do it. So I hope you took notes. Hope you're listening to this for a second or third time. We'll tune in, as I said, it'll be Tuesday next week. So looking forward to speaking to you then. But until then, apologies for Dan. Dan had technical issues. His internet kept cutting out all the way through. We were hoping he was going to come back, but he just couldn't get his internet to work. But he sends his apologies. He will be back next week, as will I. Don't forget, as always, keep rushing.